My name is Vincent, and I've been working on a little side project called React Native DOM. To start off, just a little bit about me. That's me. Uh, I'm a software engineer at Symantec. I'm also just on the side doing a little bit of amateur music producing, side project Connoisseur, and Steely-Eyed Missile Man. And you can follow all of my crazy stuff that I try to do and sometimes succeed on Twitter uh, at that handle. So to start off, because I still feel like I need to assume that nobody knows what this is, uh, what is React Native DOM? And I like to describe it, or at least its tagline, as an experimental comprehensive port of React Native to the web. And the way I sort of like to summarize, or at least what makes it different, is with three pillars. The first being how it's architected, how it handles layout, and its developer experience. And it's primarily due to the fact that it matches those pillars with how it's done in React Native. So if we start with the architecture, when React Native was announced, there was this great slide that Tom Uchino presented. This is like the highest of the high level architecture diagram. You have the two threads, the JS background thread, which is where you're writing all your React Native code, and it's basically, instead of calling a DOM API, it's sending a message to the main native thread, and the main native thread reads that and then actually does a native operation, and back and forth. And React Native DOM actually shares that exact same architecture, except it's in a web worker, and it treats the JS, the browser's main thread, as the native main thread. And really, that my sort of epiphany, or why I started this project, was realizing that the asynchronous bridge in React Native behaved the same exact way that web workers communicate. And this is still pretty high level. And I actually recently, in React Native DOM's issues, there was a big discussion about people asking why, just why. And there was a great response from, like, I didn't actually contribute to the conversation because I felt like I should stay out of that, but I created this diagram, which is a little bit deeper. Yukiya Nakagawa created this to show that React Native DOM shares what React Native shares between iOS and Android, but then deviates where React Native deviates on iOS and Android. And I thought that was a really good sort of showcase of the sort of parity I was aiming for with React Native DOM. But enough about architecture. We can go to the second pillar, layout. And layout is powered by Yoga, which also, why? Doesn't really make any sense. Because Yoga, for those who don't know, is a C++ implementation of Flexbox. And we have Flexbox on the web. Why would we want to run a re-implementation of Flexbox somewhere where we already have Flexbox? And it actually gets us a lot, because Yoga, while it may have started as a one-to-one recreation of Flexbox, has sort of evolved into its own beast, and things don't behave the exact same way as it does on the web. And so this allows us to be like, okay, I know for sure that this is going to behave like it does on native, because I'm literally running the same exact thing. And like, Yoga has stuff like the aspect ratio prop, which just doesn't exist in CSS. In CSS, we need to do like weird padding hacks. With this, we don't. And if you're using that, it would have sort of broken if you just tried to run it, that equivalent CSS that you wrote on React Native, to the actual Flexbox model. We also get on layout events, and now while those are asynchronous on React Native, it is still sort of given to us on the JS thread earlier than when we would have gotten it on the actual DOM, because on the DOM you can't actually access layout without calculating and applying it. And in this case, because we actually have those values before we apply it, because layout is in userland, we can get that. Big flashy thing with this is that we get layout animations. Again, because we have the values and we can choose what we're going to do with them, it's like we can choose to say, okay, we're not going to actually ever apply these layout values. We're going to run an animation using those values instead. And as this presentation may very clearly be using that layout animation API exclusively for all of its transitions. So it's pretty powerful. And then initially I was using Asm.js because that's kind of what they provide in the Yoga repo. But I took it a little further and compiled it to WebAssembly. And that's how it runs. It's a lot smaller. It's maybe around half the size, but it is still big. And then to sort of wrap up these three pillars, developer experience. So the developer experience is powered by Metro Bundler, which is the bundler used on React Native. And this is sort of important because it achieves what I like to call theoretical zero config support for existing React Native projects. Now, the reality of that is a little bit more complicated, but that's sort of the goal, and that's achievable. It's not like I need to introduce a Webpack config because it's not using Webpack, it's using the bundler that you're already using. And you get all just sort of, Metro has some pretty cool features. We get DPI and platform aware asset loading. We get hot reload, and you can hot reload multiple platforms sort of already with React Native, iOS, and Android. But because this fits into the ecosystem like this, this means that you can do all three, Android, iOS, and web, all from the same packager instance. We have the symbolicate function, which allows us for like that React error overlay. We can actually get the source maps without needing to open the dev tools and having the browser sort of force and get that for us. And soon, this is a coming soon thing, something I've been working on. Metro and the React Native CLI has a link command, React Native link, and theoretically, if I can get this to actually work, but I have made good progress, you can run that React Native link, and it will also link native modules for your web apps. So basically, the stuff that's run on the main thread. Now, like, this was all about, like, I've talked about this before previously, and I wanted to go over sort of, if you look at the repo, the commits on the master have been a little quiet. That doesn't mean I haven't been working on it. It's still pretty consistently being worked on. Primarily, the big thing is React Native 56, and now sort of, it's agile, right? It spills over if I can't get it done in time. 57 now support. It's taken a pretty big amount of work. The branch is something like at least 5,000 additions and deletions just for that. And then I've also been working on getting text measurement, because Yoga, the one thing it can't do is measure text. Before, what I've done up to this point is actually rendering a hidden DOM element that had the text, measuring it, quickly and then removing it quickly. And that was my measure text algorithm. And I mean, high fidelity because it was actually rendering the text, but that sort of, it's not great for performance, and it removes the possibility of running layout in any other thread. So I've started work with that. It's sort of a partial, there's a fast path, but some of the results are interesting. It's a little hard to see because it's so small, but basically in the before you see a lot of purple at the bottom. That's layout, and now there's no more purple, so it's not touching the DOM, and it is faster. You're gonna have to take my word for it with the tiny text, but it's at least twice as fast. And this is only for like single layer text, I like to say, because in React Native you can nest text. That's sort of the thing that I don't currently handle in this way, and it gets de-opt, but it still works. The other cool thing, actually, sort of primarily as a result of this talk and building a demo for this talk, was writing what on Android, this is the class name on Android of React Native, called Native View Hierarchy Optimizer, in classic Java, just being a really long class name. And what that does is will optimize out elements from your tree that are layout only. Meaning, like, you know, if you work with Flexbox, you've had to do this all the time, where you've just created a container, let's say on the web, a div that's really just providing a new Flexbox context, where it's like if you want things laid out in a column inside a row. And really, they do nothing but provide that sort of new Flexbox layout context. So since we do layout in userland, we can just remove those from the tree and just lay the things out as if they were there, but without actually rendering through the tree. And I did a test with it. You see at the bottom, I'm just counting how many DOM elements there are in this RN tester app. And after the change, it ended up decreasing by over 300 DOM nodes with no change in visual appearance. And like, this is what gets me really excited about this project, because I don't know if you can do this without performing layout in userland, because you just don't have that info. And I mean, maybe the web platform could do it, but that's asking a lot. So like, this is, when I think about why I do this side project, it's things like this, because it's just a lot of fun to implement. And then as a final thing, I have been rewriting the native module API, because I previously used decorators to bind and expose those modules up to the worker thread, and with the upgrade to Babel 7, it broke everything, so I had to remove them. But to put more context into that, and something that I've been wanting to talk about a lot, but it's sort of difficult because it's been rewritten, and like, I knew it was going to be rewritten, and it might still be rewritten again sometime. But a lot of people have been asking is like, how do you write a native module? I feel like I need to put quotes around that, because this is still on the web. If I could, I would have named it React Native, but NPM doesn't allow quotes in their package names. So if you have, like, this is an example sort of theoretical API, and this is how it would be accessed from the JS or worker thread, where you want to like load a font by URL and attach it to a name. And this is sort of how you would call it, but it's sort of that question of, how do I build a DOM native module and expose it in this way? And without like any specific like starting fresh, like let's say this is what that class would look like. It has that function and it sort of mimics that structure of that call that you're getting from native modules. And what we want to do is both expose the class, which sort of represents that object, and the method. And before, what I did, and this should look familiar to anybody who has done iOS native module binding, is it was done through decorators. And it used the same exact names as iOS did. And so that would be just exposing the module. Exposing the function was this sort of, I'm still not happy. I don't know why I named everything like that. It's a bit much. But then you needed to, like, this is a function type promise, and the way I handled it earlier was really the function received IDs, because other platforms could use like type inference and sort of reflection to determine, oh, this is going to be a callback, and I'll take the ID and pre-convert it to a callback. So unfortunately, you needed to do it manually. And so you need access to the bridge, and luckily these modules are constructed with the bridge as an argument so that you have a reference. And then you could call then and get the callbacks from the IDs. And that was a bit much, especially for the promises. The new way that I'm still sort of messing with is if we remove everything, now to sort of get the initial plumbing, you extend a new sort of base module that provides that plumbing. It's just the name that you're exposing is just a static property, and then you just add some $signs. I'm not very happy with it, but without using decorators, like, I mean, you could have a higher order function that has a description, but this is actually sort of the most type-ish safe method that I came up with. It's $2 because it's a promise. It would be $1 if it's a callback, primarily because the $sign actually comes from how React 360 exposes modules. They use the $sign. But then they have like just nothing be the default like exposed, and then underscore is not sending it over the bridge. So I wasn't too happy with that, so my response was $signs. But this is all sort of very abstract, and I want to get into something a little bit more concrete. So I do have a demo. Now, that's not the demo. That's the demo. So I had been working on this demo for like a while, and just as a heads up, apparently a week ago, somebody announced their side project, which is basically this exact idea, which is basically I attempted to recreate the Apple Music UI in React Native DOM. And while certainly I got it to sort of work in this layout, I do think it looks better in this sort of layout. And if we go down, and this is all coming from the Apple Music API. So these are my actual playlists. And I have a nice React meetup. And if I actually press one, it should. And we get the whole now playing. If we pause it, and this is all just animated. Like, this is not anything like React Native DOM specific. This is just React Native. And that's sort of what I think is powerful. You can go next. And, you know, it's still playing in the background when you go. And I don't know, it might be hard to tell on this. But I ported Blur View. Only works in Safari because it's the only one that, like, Safari and Edge of all things. So, like, the opposite of good support. But then obviously you can open up and you can pause it and you get those full. And to close it, I slacked a little bit. If I click up here, it doesn't just close like it does on iOS. You do need to do a drag. And then if you go next, it's all from the API. I didn't implement the sliders for volume and sort of track progress, but I have a touch bar, so I can move it, and it works. And so, like in terms of concreteness, what I wanted to show was, so with React navigation, you do need to load a font because it uses React Native vector icons, which is font-based. And pretty much it's like just this. Just this right, or actually, wait, no, that's an image, isn't it? That's an image. Oh, yeah. Okay. So maybe it was just these playthings. I was giving React navigation shade without needing to. But so as you see here, this is actually in the JS. I have a load async function that if we go into the font, so like this has a little bit more infrastructure around it, but it basically results in, like in this case, it's called load font, and it's just a promise, and it's just managing is loaded. This is basically an exposition of the font API. And if we actually go into the native modules, you have the font loader, and this is what it actually looks like, and it's still pretty like simple. It's very similar to that, just that style sheet injection is just done here, and really it's just you're doing DOM stuff again. We're all used to it. And using this font face observer, which is a third-party library that just gives you a promise and tells you when the font has finished loading. And then one last thing I just want to mention that sort of as a caveat to React Native DOM that I've been experiencing more and more is that more and more APIs are requiring things to be triggered as a result of a user action, and that causes problems. And this is sort of my plea to all of you and maybe the live stream to we should probably start thinking about this, because if you have code that like your app logic running in a web worker and you're handling events over that web worker threshold, you can't actually trigger any of these APIs. If we go back to the presentation, it is a React Native DOM project, and I need to go full screen, right? And full screen doesn't work without being triggered via a user action. So what did I do? When I press F, which triggers that code, I can go in and find okay, that doesn't work. Oh yeah, it's in DOM modules, full screen. But basically, what ends up happening is I listen to both full screen change and I listen to full screen error. And generally, when something happens that's like, no, you can't do this because it's not in a response to a user gesture, I handle it by using this alert library that creates a requesting full screen. And this is just pure native thread stuff. And when I press that, it gets to full screen. And so this is the sort of stuff React Native DOM is interesting, but there are some roadblocks still that I can't just solve in userland. But if you want to come on this journey with me and help me out, You can follow the project here on GitHub. And again, you can follow me here. Thank you guys so much.